have the privilege and pleasure of introducing Dr. Joel Jeffrey. And his presentation is Making What Actually Happens Accessible. First, a little bit about Dr. Jeffrey. He received his Ph.D. in mathematics from Caltech in 1969. Then to the University of Colorado, where he studied computer science. Over the next 5 years, he divided his time between computer science and clinical psychology. Most of his work in psychology was in descriptive psychology under Peter Ossorio. After finishing his Ph.D. in computer science, he was assistant professor at Vanderbilt University for 3 years. He then moved to Bell Laboratories, where he used Ossorio's basic process unit formalism to build the first brain-based expert system, one of the first 2 industrial expert systems. He then moved to Northern Illinois University, where he was an associate and then professor of computer science. At NIU, his research was focused on fields at the intersection of computer science and psychology, including artificial intelligence, software engineering, and behavioral economics. In 1999, he developed and patented an extension of Ossorio's subject matter reference relevance technology and founded a company, H5 Technology, based on that, on the subject matter relevance technology. These days, his professional interests are in physics and using descriptive psychology to formulate issues related to worlds and consciousness, including ultimate consciousness. Dr. Jeffrey.
Descriptive psychology.
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Sorry.
Morning.
Morning.
As you can see, we're going to talk about what actually happened. Oh, we can go ahead. So, space one down there. And I'd like to do that by starting with a reminder of the basics. The central concepts of descriptive psychology are people, behavior, and worlds. What is that? Well, that's on its face the subject matter of psychology, as Peter Ossorio pointed out early on in, for example, Meaning and Symbolism, the first thing I ever read of Ossorio's. That's because it's about people behaving, and behavior takes place in the world. That's not unique. He's not the first person to make that observation. What is unique is the formulation of the concepts of people, behavior, and worlds. I'm willing to make the all 2-part bet. Most of us in here and online have got a pretty good grasp of the descriptive formulations of person and behavior. The second part of that bet is if a couple of descriptive psychologists, Gil and Will, who many of you know well, were talking, chatting over a coffee or a beer, and Gil said to Will, "So, have you read Ossorio's What Actually Happens?" Most likely, Will's response would be, "Are you serious?" That's because Ossorio's What Actually Happens is maybe arguably his most profound work, but I think probably inarguably his least accessible, the one that people have the most trouble getting into and making sense of. Today's goal is to tackle that inaccessibility so that everybody at the end of this hour comes away with, "Oh, I see what's going on there." Oh, sorry, do I need to be here? Oh, I see it up here, I know. Thank you, I see what they're doing. Everybody to come away with, "Oh, I see what's going on here." and would be able, if they wanted to, if they felt like it, to go more deeply into it. And also that they would see why doing that, that someone wanted to do that, would see why it might be worth your while. Why is that worth doing? Well, since of course preliminary, a couple of things, three things. First off, it's a fantastic, amazing achievement. Ossorio has done something that is unique in the history of Western, and to my knowledge, Eastern philosophy. People have been struggling with how to formulate the concept of the world since there have been philosophers, and mostly made a hash of it. They haven't come up with anything that would qualify as a precise formulation. They've said a lot of things, some of which is quite worthwhile. Wynn mentioned some of those from Wittgenstein, but they haven't accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. Secondly, more pragmatically, as we'll see, it can help make you a better therapist. You will see why that is in a little bit. And finally, it can open new doors for inquiry. So, recapping a tiny bit, Ossorio's starting point was, as I mentioned, the subject matter of psychology is persons behaving in the world. That's the beginning. But his second observation had to do with what's a science and what's not a science. Whatever else it is, he said, in order to be a science, a field must be systematic, precise, comprehensive, and have a formulation that is capable of being taken literally. By contrast, Lord of the Rings is a depiction of a complete world, but can't be taken literally. Therefore, he pointed out, and I believe this is in the forward meeting in symbolism, as he said at the time, the early 60s, if I have the chronology right, as he said, we do not at this point have a science of psychology. Such a thing might be valuable, he said, although it's hard to tell because we don't have one. To my knowledge, we still don't, with the exception of descriptive psychology. So, noticing this significant lack, he set out to create one, specifically a precise, systematic, comprehensive formulation of person behavior in the world. And he did it. The result is the first and only actual science of psychology. And I characterize it that way because it is the only precise, systematic, comprehensive formulation of the subject matter of psychology. So how did he do that? It's been said, and I looked for the source of this quote, but couldn't actually identify it. But it has been said a number of times. A genius is someone who looks at what everyone else looks at, but sees something different. Ray Bergner has done a wonderful job of pointing out that what Ossorio did for psychology.
Sorry. Sorry.
No problem.
There's one in every crowd.
No shame, no shame. We've all been there. What Ossorio did for psychology is what Newton did for physics. So what did Newton do for physics? Okay. The view from 10,000 feet, not the detail, is that he took the already in common use terms such as force, mass, and acceleration, and precisely elaborated them in terms of each other and their formal relationships. That's what his famous F equals ma formula is. It articulates the relationship between these three concepts. The result is a refinement of ordinary language about the physical world that's precise, systematic, and comprehensive. What Ossorio did was observe that person, behavior, reasons, relationships, place in the world, and all those concepts about people themselves constitute a formal system of concepts. And by formal, we mean defined in terms of each other. And he goes on at some length about this because it's a tricky point. He says, well, what do I mean by formal? I mean, they're defined in terms of each other. Now, most people have a lot of trouble with that. And since this is all about accessibility, let me try and, I hope, clarify that a tiny bit. Many of you probably have memories of geometry in high school. Some of you pleasant, for some of you not pleasant, but memories. And when I took geometry, initially, probably this is the same for most of us, they start out by saying geometry is all about three things: point, line, and plane. And these three things are defined in terms of each other. And I vividly remember that drove all of us in the class crazy. Because we had all been taught by the age of 15, well, no, you have to define your basic concepts. Otherwise, nobody knows what you're talking about. And we don't do it like that in geometry. Point is defined as the intersection of two lines. Lines are defined by two planes, and so forth and so forth. There's nothing outside geometry to look to for a definition of a point or line or a plane. Eventually we got used to it, and we used the concepts of point, line, and plane. We're okay with that. That's what Pete means by formal. Person, behavior, for example, are defined in terms of each other. Person is an individual who paradigmatically engages in deliberate action. He then went on to explicitly articulate those relationships between these fundamental concepts. The intentional action formulation, the deliberate action formulation, the CRJ diagram, and all the rest of it. Paul Zeiger once observed, and I thought in very profound observation, the CRJ diagram is the F equals MA of human behavior. And I thought he absolutely nailed it. So we got 2 out of 3. Person and behavior. A person is an individual whose behavior is deliberate action. Well, what about the third one? World. We haven't talked about it yet. We need better language, philosopher's language, such as what one sometimes hears. Our conceptual scheme is useful. It's not pointless. It takes us a little bit of the way there. It reminds us that there is a scheme whose elements are concepts, but it doesn't tell us what they are. Nor does ordinary language that simply points, like our world, which we all use all the time. And they don't do the job because what we're out to do is create, what Pete was out to do, is create a systematic, precise, comprehensive formulation of the subject matter, including world. And these aren't precise and systematic formulations. They are not articulated by those phrases. For example, it's a logical fact, a fact about the concepts of processes and so forth, that a process produces a change in what is the case is itself a state of affairs. That fact is not incorporated in language like our conceptual scheme. So what actually happens is the third piece. It's the third leg the stool stands on, if you will. It's what we need to make everything else precise. Without that formulation of world, we don't have a science. Might be good, not saying it's not worthwhile. For example, take a look at intentional action. W, K, K, H, P, and so forth. W, K, A, and P are situation and process concepts. If we have no precise formulation of situation and process, we don't have a precise formulation of intentional action. Again, not to say it can't be used, but it's not what we're out to do. For example, ordinary statement. Simple thing. Mary bought a car. The W and A parameters are Mary owns a car. For me. If we can't say Mary owns a car, formally, we can't formally specify Mary's behavior. What actually happens gives us what we need, that precise, systematic, comprehensive formulation of world. So let's see how it does that. Ossorio's starting point was to observe that historically, people have used 4 different concepts to talk about what's world. What is a world? What's real? Objects, processes, events, and states of affairs. What's the world? A great big complicated object. What's the world? Wittgenstein, a great big state of affairs, everything that is the case, and so forth. There's been a great deal of argument over the last millennia about which one is the right one, which one is what the world really is. And a lot of very peculiar talk. Much of it, I find entirely incomprehensible. Things like the world is an object with process aspects. I don't really know what that means. Ossorio's central insight was that all 4 of these things are what is real. Don't ask which one is real. Notice that they're all real. And he gives examples of them. They're all real. They, together with their interrelationships, make up a formal system, defined in terms of each other, just like point, line, and plane. But the relationships are a lot more complicated when we study in high school. Together, they answer the question, what's a world? One observation, based on my own firsthand difficulties and what I've heard other people talk about, is that there are 3 big stumbling blocks in trying to read what actually happens. And they are, what are those transition rules? Actually, people say, what the hell is this? The table 1, he refers to it as no or a simple ordinary thing. What is this name description format business? What is he talking about? And what are those complicated things he calls descriptive units? So we're going to take a look at each of those in order. What are those transition rules? They are the articulation of the relationships. They tell us, they give us one kind of answer to the question, what's an object? What's a process? What's a state of affairs? There are 10 of them, and I just listed 5, because these are really the core. What's a state of affairs? It's a collection of other related states of affairs. Oh my God, isn't that circular? Everybody says, yes, it is. That's the game, guys. They're fundamental. We don't get to re-describe them in terms of something else. State of affairs, objects, processes, and events. Okay, well, that state of affairs set for a moment. What's an object? Oh, an object is something with object constituents. Oh, thanks a lot. More circular definitions. Yes. We're inside the system. What lets us be inside the system is that we all already use it. That's Ossorio's observation. That is the analog about the human world and the real world of Newton's observation that people already understand, force, mass, and acceleration. I ran across a quote from Newton in preparing this, in which he said, you have to define force, mass, and acceleration because people already understand them. It's exactly the rule Ossorio made. These rules define, articulate, I know in descriptive we don't use the word define, but I'm going to use it anyway. I'm going to cheat a little bit. Define the relationships between 4 kinds of real things. But those rules need some discussion. In the beginning of that discussion, is this name description format. Let's notice each of these rules. Let's see if I can manage to back up. Oh, good. Each of these rules is laid out in a certain way. There's a thing, there's the word is, and there's some more words identifying some other things. That's what I've got here. Each rule is of the form something or other, a process, an object, what have you, some name, followed by some English language that is a description of it. That's the core concept of a rule. That's all there is. So when you look at these complicated things, you say, oh, what are these things? Well, okay, so what's the state of affairs? He's giving sort of a definition of a state of affairs or of a process. There's not much more to it than that. So for example, Mary owns a car is a name, an identifier, some words. She calls it a locution. It took me years to figure out what he meant by the word locution. Yeah. It's just a thing you can study. That's all it is. Well, sometimes his language is more formal than was helpful. I'm sorry, Pete, but that's how it was for most of us. There it is. That's the locution that points to, that names, that identifies a state of affairs, and there's the description. And we can use a different notation instead of the ordinary English one, owns a car. We can use a different notation, owns, parentheses, two things, Mary and car. And this is a mathematics style notation for the relationship owns, holds between Mary and car. He says he owes this is mathematical logic style, which he took straight from Carnap. He says somewhere in the introduction, he took this from Carnap. And Carnap was one of the founders of mathematical logic, and I believe the late 19th century. Whoops, went too far. But so the other thing we got to talk about, sort of stumbling blocks, is like here's this big block, but some big blocks have got smaller blocks that it's easy to trip over, easy to get lost if you're trying to step over them or encompass them. Come back, what happened? I assume. No, that's good. Oh, that's good. Let's bring that back. Oh, we did that one. Good. Okay. Oh, sorry. The technology is defeating me here. Okay. So every one of those rules is of the form. Something is some collection of other related things. We're going to talk about names, as Ossorio explains in some detail. It's a core concept here, but it's unusual. It's difficult. It's not difficult, but you got to get used to it. After you get used to it, it's like, oh, okay. But at first, it's like it's foreign. It's not a normal way of talking. So this something is we need a way to talk about it. One of the things language does is talk about what's real. We need some way to talk about it. We need to give it a name. This computer, that light, all of us here together, this presentation, those are all English phrases. And we're using them as names of situations, of objects, of things going on. Some, as Pete calls it, an identifying locution. Now, this is a little bit subtle. It's not doing anything more than pointing. In the same way that I say, you ask me, who's that? That's Ralph. Am I describing Ralph? Oops, sorry, I got to be back in the camera. Am I describing Ralph? No, of course not. I'm just pointing and giving a mere name that distinguishes, that points to that individual over there, rather than all the other things I could point to. These are names. Also, the other related things are identified equally by other names, just as he calls them, identifying locutions. They don't have to mean anything. They're, as Pete puts it, just placeholders. Yeah, it's helpful to keep in mind, we're doing something with language that is not like ordinary talk. Usually, if you say, what's that thing over there in front of you? Well, it's a chair. I'm using a word that we all know, and I'm giving, and because we all know it, I'm giving you a certain degree of description. It's a chair, not a dog, not the owl over there, and so forth and so forth. We're not doing that here. We're using, as he puts it, purely formal names. And that's why he says they could be any darn thing you like. He makes quite a point of this. So you could call it a rose, you could call it X33Y19. Why would you do that? Well, because of your, depends what you're doing. You can call it any darn thing you like. They're just identifiers. Some of you familiar with computer programming know about this. They're just names. They don't have to mean anything. If you're not a programmer, don't worry about it. You can just ignore what I said. So the result is you got a name, description, pair. Maybe I can point with the screen here. Not fairly effectively. Sort of a name, description, pair, or the description, and then where the thing and the description of it are just specified by a bunch of names. And I skipped over, but I don't want to continue to do that. Similarly with relationships between the constituents. If I'm going to describe that chair, it's not good enough to just give the parts of the chair. I got to tell you how they're related. If I got a collection of legs and backs and seats scattered around this room, that's not a chair. We would normally call that a part of the chair. Again, names identified by formal identifiers. Second one, we got to look at the other sort of sub-stumbling block. Sorry for the clumsy language. Is the other one, Ossorio goes into at some length. He asks, what does is mean in these rules? And this is a place where a lot of people go, oh my God, what is he doing? He's actually trying to do something pretty simple. He's trying to tell you what he means when he uses that word. Some will remember this is the way that people have gotten into great trouble. What he means by that is, he's saying, this thing I want to talk to you about is the same thing as these other related things. I find that one the easiest to use myself. That's individual, there are people might like different ones. Also, equally, this thing that I want to talk to you about can be described as these other related things. The most elaborate one, the most formal one, which is sometimes useful, to say this thing, for example, I'm getting one kind, to say that this is a state of affairs is to say that it is made up of other things and those things are related in particular ways. No, we don't go around in the world talking like that normally. Much easier to say, this is the same thing as those. But sometimes you need a complicated technical way to say it. Depends on your situation, shows you what you're doing. For example, let's go back to Mary owns a car. Mary owns a car, names the state of affairs. Rule 1 reminds us that a state of affairs is, and there's that word, is the same thing as saying other related things. So the state of affairs that me and Mary owns the car is the same thing as saying there are two constituents, Mary and car, specified by name, and the relationship owns a car. So you can say, one reaction people often have is, wait a second, you're cheating. You're not saying anything. You're just taking the word owns and using it as this weird thing called an identifier. That's right. We're not saying anything about what it means to own a car. If you want to say that other stuff, you give other descriptions. So far, we're just getting started. It's sometimes described as the view from 20,000 feet. Not much detail here, and that's on purpose. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. So, what have we just done? Or better, what has Ossorio just created? More carefully stated. We all learn in school at some point. If you want to understand a sentence, parse it, pick it apart. Some of us learn to diagram sentences. Parse the sentence, and then the nouns and the verbs are refer to things. They have reference. There's a whole field out there called denotational semantics. The nouns refer to things, verbs refer to things you can do or things that happen. Ossorio has changed the game completely. New game. Treat the sentence as just a name, as we just saw with Mary and her car. The sentence, Mary owns a car, is a mere name to identify the state of affairs with a couple of constituents. The meaning is then given by specifying the constituents and how they relate. Namely, in this case, the relationship owns. Doesn't say very much. Oh, that's right. The world's a complicated place. If you need to say more, you'll do it with more descriptions. Now, we got to say a little more about that word related. And I will testify, this was a big stumbling block for me. Because we hear related all the time. What does it mean related? A and B are related means they've got one and maybe more relationships that we can point to via a name, an identifying location. Couple of subtleties that usually, I think, well, I'm making a guess here. I'm making an empirical conjecture, something not often done in descriptive psychology. But I'm going to give you my guess. This is often a trouble spot. People say, well, wait a second, what do you mean by a relationship? There's a couple of tricky businesses here. First off, the identity, when we want to talk about a relationship, we may not have a good name for it. We may not have a customary name. There are many, many, many more relationships in the world than there are names. The example Pete used to give was most of us are old enough to be amused by this. He used to say, we have no name for the relationship between the carburetor and the steering wheel of a car. Now, some of you will say, what the hell is a carburetor? That's the thing people have before fuel. It's that thing that put gas in the engine. But that's okay. Any name will do. All we need is a locution. So I just gave you one. The relationship between the carburetor and the steering wheel. Isn't that stupid and clumsy? You bet. But it serves the purpose for the moment. For other purposes, I'll want a better one. Maybe I'll call it C-W. Good enough. I just need something I can say that points to it. Any locution that serves in the community that's talking about it to identify it. Secondly, as I've been listening in the conference, I'm less sure about what I thought earlier when I was preparing for this. I think, well, as I say, I'm less sure. Maybe some of you later could correct me. I'd be interested in knowing. We are not limited to only those relationships that are physical, like the carburetor and steering wheel. Not just physical or mathematical ones. For many people, this is a stumbling block. They say, wait a minute, you're talking about relationship, man. You're talking about the physical world. You know, the computer's on top of the podium. The speakers in front of the audience in front of physical, geographical relationship. For some of us, someone, I can't remember who, oh yeah, Dave Bender, used a lovely, expressed it in a lovely way. I really like this Dave. Some of us are handicapped. We grew up studying math and physics. So we're used to thinking relationship means, by God, the physical relationship. Wrong. And this is my conjecture, it may be wrong. I conjecture, I believe that that's actually true to a certain degree of almost everybody in Western culture. Because we all grow up embedded in a culture in which science and math are endemic, and it's practically in the air we breathe that what's real is what's physical. You may not think about it, but it's there, and it's easy to acquire the distinction, let me be careful, that what's real is what's physical, even if you don't know you've acquired it. So I don't know, I would never say I know that's true of you, but I know it's true of a lot of people, because I talk to them. You read the newspaper, what do you see? Many, many times, we know this effect is real because it's been verified by PET scans. All the time, what's real is what's physical. Well, sorry. We've got a much wider range of relationships. Friend of, audience member, speaker, student, professor, husband, wife, and so on and so on. None of those are physical. But they can all be identified and named. I just did it. Audience member, speaker. What is that relationship? What does that mean? We're not trying to do that yet. We'll do that with other descriptions. They can be recognized and named. So we've got states of affairs, processes, and so forth, identified by name, and described by giving more names and named relationships. This is a new game. So you're gonna read, when you read what actually happens, you wanna know going in, you're reading a new game. It's like learning chess or learning Go. Learning one of the online games. They take you out. But this is the core notion of what you're doing. Trying to talk about the real world in a different way. What has Ossorio accomplished here? What's the result? A single system of formally stated concepts, objects, processes, events, affairs, and their relationships, each identified, each articulated by name, description, pairs. Okay. And that's how we articulate the concept of world. That's the thing that never existed in the world before. Brand new. Before we go on to talk about those units, the third thing, a couple of really, really valuable issues about practical use of this. One is that make a big difference to us in using this and in thinking about it. One is flexibility. I kind of alluded to this when I talk about giving more descriptions. Rules 1 and 5 mean we can compose these things. We can take things, descriptions of things, and describe them as parts of other things. And he talks about this as composition and decomposition. This is pretty ordinary stuff. Here's a composition. Table, water bottle. Water bottle plus table, Shazam, new object. That 10 seconds ago didn't exist. Nothing fancy about this, it's ordinary, everyday stuff. We can compose these things into larger things. Similarly, we can break them down into parts. That's the thing the physical scientists are always telling us you have to do. You break the computer down into its parts, blah, 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 blah. We can compose things and decompose things. For example, a less obvious, simple one, Russia's attack on Kiev, which we are describing as an object, is a constituent of, names a constituent of, a larger state of affairs. Named, you know, we have that word in English, namely. Named, Russia is at war with Ukraine. So what the question we all, as practicing descriptive psychologists, ask ourselves more or less all the time, what are they doing by doing this? Is looking for the larger state of affairs that this specific behavior is part of. We're using this composition thinking. Secondly, may be more immediately useful. That phrase is the same thing as. That's what Pete refers to as re-description. Remember that in our group, famous reminder, never underestimate the power of re-description. This thing, this individual we've singled out by name, can be described in many ways and many kinds of ways. For example, right now you're all observing a process, me giving a talk. Equally, you could say, you could describe what you are seeing as you're observing a state of affairs. It's a fact, a state of affairs that I'm giving a talk. Or you could call it an object, big complicated object. Object comprised of you all, me in this room. But, and here's the nitty gritty. Here's what really matters. That's kind of the, okay, yes, so what? Observation. That's cute, but why would we care? And here's why, or we're on our way to, it's almost why. None of those descriptions is privileged. None of them is the right one. None is what's really going on. They are all equally descriptions of what is happening right now. This is another way Ossorio changed the game. We don't look for the right description. We don't look for the central one, the key one, the answer to the question, what's really happening here? We ask ourselves, what can we say about this? How can we describe this? So this is at the top of this slide is a summary of what I just said. A state of affairs is not the same thing as any description of it. The description isn't the individual being singled out. So there's a pragmatic principle, which I first saw Pete demonstrate in a clinical class with good old experience of anxiety, which I suspect many of you remember. He told us to go and read a case, and we all came in, and we read it. We all came in having read it. And somebody said, well, what's going on here? And various students said, well, here's what's going on. Here's how I think what's happening. And Pete demonstrated a different way of behaving. The behavior that he demonstrated is, don't ask what's going on with this guy. He asked a different question than any of us asked. He said, what can we say about this? For me, that was what Paul Zeiger once described as an intellectual thunderbolt. Nobody ever asked that. I went, oh my God. It's a different kind of question. And this is what I alluded to. This is why understanding this and about just describing something versus the thing being described can help you be a better therapist. Now, probably a lot of you have already mastered this, I know that. But sometimes it helps to have it singled out, articulated. You, as Ossorio demonstrated in that class, you get different answers if you ask, what can I say about this? Rather than what's going on here. And by the way, I use this myself all the time. All the time. I'm looking at some hairy formula in a quantum field theory textbook. And I don't ask myself what's going on. Because I'm usually completely confused about what's going on. It's very different if I ask myself, what can I say about this? That helps me say, oh, helps me give answers like, what can I say about this? Well, it's identifying a relationship between these two parties. Ah, I got it. You get very different answers if you ask, what can I say about Benny, for example, rather than what's going on with Benny. And all of us in the classroom have the same experience to one degree or another. It's like, oh, wow, look at that. A smaller stumbling block. Identity, he calls it identity coordination. And again, most people say, eh? What? What is he talking about? Very simple idea. In a somewhat, well, he's being formal. So he's got a formal language for this really ordinary idea. That is something, an object, a process, what have you, may be, and in fact, in the real world, often is, a constituent of many worlds. But the individual, the thing, remains the same, described differently. And here's an example. What is this? This big thing you see on the screen. Well, in the art world, that individual is described as the concert by Vermeer. A fabulous piece of art by one of the great artists of the 17th century. In the FBI world, this individual is described as a famous stolen painting worth $200 million. I'm not making those up, by the way, I took them off of the website, but not stolen. But it's one individual named and described differently in different worlds. But it's still one thing, one individual. And we'll see an important clinical application of that in a moment. Last one we'll talk. I got good news for you. This one's easy. We've got an answer to what's the word, what's the state of affairs, and so on. But Ossorio points out that's hard to use. That set of rules ain't easy. Somebody comes up to you and says, what's the state of affairs? And you say to them, well, state of affairs is a state of affairs is a set of other related objects, processes, events, and states of affairs. They're not going to say, oh, thanks, no, I got it. We need an easier answer. That's what the descriptive units do. That's their purpose. So, what's a process? Processes don't look like this. It's got a name, and it's got a description. And the description is all those ugly details. The steps and the things that are being messed with in the process, and their logical roles. What's the state of affairs? Same deal. This is your easy answer. You used to talk about back pocket, hip pocket arguments. You whip out your picture of a state of affairs. Probably not, but conceptually. You say, oh, state of affairs, it's something that looks like this. It's got a name, and here's all its details. You give relationships and the things that are in the relationships, specified by name. So what's the payoff? I promised you that I would talk about why it might be worth your while to dig into this. First off, it's the logical foundation of multiculturalism. It demonstrates that multiculturalism is not a fashion, any more than gravity is a fashion. It's an inextricable aspect of the real world. So what difference, you might as well ask, well, what difference does it make to be able to describe gravity precisely and carefully? This lets us practice multiculturalism carefully and precisely, as T.J. Peake's work on the multiple worlds of the healthcare organization showed in extraordinary power and detail. As he pointed out, if you work in an organization and you use hospital, I'm going to skip this because I'm running short of time. You cannot make sense of your organization, which means you can't be effective in it. If you cannot go back and forth between the multiple worlds of your organization, in the case of healthcare, medical, financial, and operational, sometimes called the systems world, because people operating professionally in those worlds do different things and value different things. The value of having a clear articulation, to be more specific, is that it lets you, when you need to, and you often, in a multicultural situation, you often do need to show everybody how what the other guy is doing makes sense. Not just tell them. Often reminders, let's be nice, let's not talk about people as though what they're doing doesn't make sense. It's much more powerful to be able to show people how it makes sense, and this lets you do that. Secondly, the promised clinical application. Identity. Long ago, I had a conversation with Pete in which he was talking about people feeling fragmented. And you hear about this quite a bit today. He said, sometimes you get somebody coming in to see him, and they say, I feel like a bunch of fragments. I don't feel like a single person. I don't know who I am. I don't know what I am. This formulation reminds all of us, a person is one individual, whether they feel like that or not. They are, in fact, one individual with, especially today, quite likely, a place in multiple worlds. And although having places in multiple worlds may lead to painful conflicts, as Ossorio explained to me, feeling fragmented is much worse. He said, it's the difference between pain and agony. It's a terrible situation. And as he explained it to me, your job as a therapist is to help them see that. In fact, they are one individual with lots of places and lots of worlds. They're not fragments. They just got multiple places. What the increase in behavioral potential from going from nothing to, oh my God, I can operate in those worlds. But you got to help them see that. And he explained to me, that's your job. That's the therapist's job. And finally, two things that I think are, I got 5 minutes, Fred?
Yes.
Good, I can do it. Areas so far untouched or almost untouched by descriptive psychologists. Number one, the body. As Ned has pointed out, and spot on, I think it's fair to characterize our society as having a severe allergy to talking about bodies. And my diagnosis is that it's a reaction formulation to years and years of having people say, people are nothing but biological organisms. Well, we all know that's bullshit. But we don't have to refuse to talk about bodies. Sometimes it's useful. And Ned Kirsch did a wonderful bit of work, more than a bit, articulating that connection by saying the relationship between person and brain is the brain provides for, and there's that name of a relationship. The relationship identified by provides for behavior and all of a person's characteristics. It's a fabulous foundational formulation, but it cries out for articulation, for our elaboration. There's a lot more to say. For example, neurological impairment, which we have heard reference to many times in this and other conferences. How do we make sense? How do we articulate just what's going on with somebody with a severe neurological impairment? How can we as descriptive psychologists help someone faced with a situation like that, such as the man whose wife has advanced Alzheimer's, a case that I personally know, not me, but a friend of ours. The sister of someone whose personality is drastically changed due to frontotemporal dementia. In what sense are the same person? Are they the same person? In one sense, not. Because if you meet this woman and you used to know her, you say, wait a second, this ain't the same lady. Surely there's more to say that is helpful than that. The final thing I want to talk about is another area that, if someone wants to, could be a very fruitful thing to look into: art and music. I submit that we are, after all, in one way, behavioral scientists. Those are, okay.
Can you just name those other concepts and not the relationships so that we can?
Which
go
ones?
to
Yeah, I'm gonna show you.
The other areas.
I'm
that-
gonna show you.
Okay.
Music, we're not gonna tackle art. So let's see if this works. Oh, good.
Because we still need that. I think I just calculated.
No. I can't understand a word of that. Not a word. But every time I hear it, it raises the hair on my arms, and as you just saw, brings actual, I'm not being metaphorical, tears to my eye. What the hell? How can this be? This is not like the meaning is so powerful in the ordinary sense of meaning, of words and so forth. How do we articulate that? We haven't even touched it. Well, I submit that it's worth touching. Charlie's gonna yell at me.
Stage go.
What do I do?
We can just say that Dr. Jeffrey gave us all goosebumps.
One last slide, to summarize.
One last slide? Okay.
Yeah, one last.
Okay, we're running
Good.
a little bit late.
So that's it.
Because of my
Leave it
fault.
right there. Yeah.
Pressure now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so. Why is this articulation worthwhile? Why might it be worth someone's while to dive into what actually happens? It gives us unparalleled power to be better behavioral scientists and better people, operating the widest possible world and worlds. Thank you. Oh, I guess maybe you shouldn't say that. I don't know if you have time for questions, or are you ready to go?
Do we want to count on, people's generosity of time and give about 10 minutes? Yes,
Sure.
is that okay? Online or the,
Wynn's got a question.
okay.
Okay,
You know,
When-
yeah, hi, the power that you're describing is, I think, an important and true dilemma. And we're trying to operate in the world of persons and our ways. When I first brought up the question of, how these things were articulated, and was speaking to a few professional philosophers, they said, well, haven't you read Hari's Matter and Method? I said, of course, I read that the year before I met Ossorio, and read What Actually Happens. They never heard of What Actually Happens. Ramhari, for example, tackled a number of these issues, both in aesthetics and in some of the themes that you talked about. And as we were talking, I pulled my volume of the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior off, where Peter is the lead article, Never Smile at a Crocodile. I mean, the idea how that's going to influence the world. And then I opened it to the editors. The editorial advisor of that issue is Ramhari. So we've got, and What Actually Happens deals with these issues in a more expansive, more elaborate ways, but nobody's ever read What Actually Happens. Ramhari's Matter and Method is part of the canon. And it's the dilemma that we continue to face, which is that the dissemination of this community's knowledge has not really affected the world of persons and our ways. It's affected us in profound ways, but there's a piece of tragedy that I think we experience when we hear things with the elegance of what you just presented.
That's although I have no answer to.
What is the book, please? Jim Waters wants to know.
Matter and Method. So one of it, you can find dozens of books that are going to deal with these kinds of issues. They came out of the period of analytic philosophy that was going on in the 60s and 70s, the same period in which Ossorio is doing his, in which he's in some ways collecting some of his thoughts and providing, in many ways, a far more elegant, differentiated view of a number of these things, but it's in isolation. Hari at this time is teaching at Oxford, and one of 5 or 6 institutions in the world that's going to produce the largest body of professional philosophers who in effect are going to create the world of knowledge about these subject matters in this fashion. And amongst psychologists, traditions,
The title of the book?
Matter Method. One book you look at is Hari's.
CJ, your turn. Unmute, CJ.
Yeah, I'm just turning on my mic. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Sometimes a little practical thing can help people grab on to the beginnings of Pete. So I was thinking about the transformations of the mathematical style formulation of relationships that Joe just presented, where you've got R, Mary, car, where R is owns. So we understand that Mary owns a car. Or it can be owns Mary O, where O is objects, and it doesn't specifically pick out her car, but creates the set of all things that Mary owns. And you have owns P for person, car, doesn't specifically pick out Mary, but creates the set of everyone who owns a car. I'm not saying anything new. Thanks.
Thank you, CJ. Anybody else online in the room?
We're good. Shirley.
I just want to thank you so much. This has not been part of what we have heard at the many conferences. And I have been waiting for this. I am on my 3rd or 4th reading of what actually happens. And the first time was, I don't get it. And now it is, I am awed by this.
Oh, great.
Yes.
You can see it.
And
Well, that's great.
I thank you so much. I think the connection to Mary, do you remember Mary's calculation? Not Mary, yeah, T, that Mary. T's calculational
One that owns the car.
system, that has been
Oh, yeah.
ignored. She did it, and we never refer back to it. This is, I just can't thank you enough. This is wonderful.
I think it'll be hard to get a more glowing evaluation of you. You just heard. Yeah, I was so immersed in your talk that, time kind of ran away with me. So thank you all for, the generosity of extending the time.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Just one last quick comment. Thank you so much for helping me see the cow.